Did you know that the foods you eat every day are destroying your gut? People think these are completely safe foods. They're used to them, and they believe these foods are good for their health. I'm Vasyl Chaika, and today we'll talk about which everyday foods are actually harming you and what you should eat to keep your gut healthy. First, we need to understand what we mean when we talk about the gut. So we have the small intestine, which comes after the duodenum. And the function of this organ, or rather this section of the gut, is to absorb all the nutrients from the food we eat. So after being turned into a sort of mush by enzymes, the food enters the small intestine, and there, thanks to absorption, these nutrients are taken up by the body. There, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and micronutrients, all of it is absorbed in the small intestine. It's important to remember that the small intestine is sterile. No microorganisms live there. This is, of course, facilitated firstly by stomach acid and bile, which is secreted. These two substances are precisely what ensure the sterility of the lower sections of the gastrointestinal tract. There is the large intestine. It is populated by microorganisms. There are more than 100 million types of different microorganisms there. And what's important is that these microorganisms also help us synthesize vitamins, for example, those of the B group. In the large intestine, the main process is the formation of fecal matter, and the large intestine is necessary so that already to eliminate everything that is unnecessary. Another function of the large intestine is what is called the formation of immunity or the immune response. That's another way people often talk about it. But it's important to remember one very important thing. The intestine is also called the second brain. The number of nerve connections present in the intestine is actually even greater than in the brain. That's why it's also called the second brain. So, the function of the intestine and its proper operation ensure that we can constantly restore our bodies. Let's take a look at which foods are harmful to our bodies. So the first product that we're used to, that we really love and consider to be very healthy, is, unfortunately, potatoes with meat. And when we have potatoes to which we add some milk or butter and then some delicious fatty meat, this is a dish we all really love. But unfortunately, this is the most dangerous product for our gastrointestinal tract. Why? Because it's a simultaneous combination of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And this disrupts the function of the upper parts of our digestive system, the stomach and the duodenum, and leads to insufficient secretion of enzymes by the pancreas itself. Of course, all this will lead to fermentation in the small intestine and the formation of excess gas. The second product, strange as it may sound, is actually the combination of borscht, which we're all used to, a nice rich borscht with sour cream. Again, it's not the borscht itself that's so bad, but specifically the addition of dairy products. Because dairy products, once again, overload the pancreas. The third product, this is the consumption of a huge amount of raw foods. In particular, these are vegetables that are not homegrown, because mainly to make them grow and look so appealing, phosphorus and other additives are used. But it's the huge amount of phosphorus that ends up in our intestines, along with this raw fiber, that once again leads to bloating. Well, the main question is, how can you check whether you have bloating or not? How can you even check if your intestines are working or not? It's a very simple test. You can lie on your back and right where your navel is, press with your fingers on the right, left, above, and below. If you feel pain in these areas, it means you have excessive gas formation. But you need to remember that even lower down is the spine, so often when the abdomen is very flat or small and a person presses, and if you find something hard in your sides, it's probably a fecal stone. No, that's not a fecal stone, that's your spine. So don't make this mistake. It's specifically the painful sensations that can even radiate to other areas. The second test we can do to check how our intestines are working, both the small and large, is to eat boiled red beetroot at a dose of 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. If you eat it and your urine becomes colored, this indicates that there is a dysfunction of the small intestine. If your stool becomes colored, this means that there is an imbalance between lacto and bifidobacteria in relation to the saprophytic flora. So, in this way, these are two simple tests. Another group of products that unfortunately are not beneficial for us if we consume them daily are flour-based products, especially those high in gluten. That is, someone who loves dumplings, someone who constantly enjoys vareniki, or someone who always prefers pasta. After all, these are exactly the foods that are often given to our children. And just so you know, there's an interesting point. A diagnosis called intussusception in children, which is when one part of the intestine slides into another. This mainly happens in the small intestine. The cause of this acute surgical condition is the consumption of foods, especially cereals, that contain a large amount of gluten. Why? Because when gluten enters the small intestine, it causes the villi to stick together, and the body reflexively tries to get rid of this condition since it reduces the surface area for nutrient absorption and leads to hypercontraction. As a result, the intestine can fold into itself, and here an acute condition arises. In the middle of the night, the child suddenly starts crying out, and then by morning or a bit later, or a little later, we see stool that looks like raspberry jelly, which is a sign of intussusception. Unfortunately, this is a surgical emergency, an acute condition, and medical help is needed here. Let's now talk about which foods are actually beneficial. Before we discuss healthy foods, it's important to understand that poor eating habits on a daily basis, if we regularly consume the foods I mentioned earlier, will lead to various gastrointestinal diseases, such as leaky gut syndrome, constipation, or, for example, diarrhea, or even irritable bowel syndrome, and so on. In other words, there will be a constant inflammatory process. What is important? If you consume these foods together and your intestines are functioning normally, nothing will happen. But if you regularly consume such foods, unfortunately, you won't have good health. So how can we help our intestines now? To help your intestines, the first thing you need is the right combination of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. The correct combination of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates in one meal should be as follows. In one meal, we consume proteins plus fats and fiber. In another meal, carbohydrates and fiber. Do not combine them. For example, if we take, since we love mashed potatoes with meat, so-called tovchanka, it should not be eaten because it contains proteins, fats, and carbohydrates together. But if we take baked potatoes with the skin, which contain a lot of potassium and fiber, then it is considered a vegetable. That is in fact baked potatoes or potatoes in their jackets. We can eat them with proteins and fats. Another important point is fiber. Fiber, like the same boiled beetroot that we eat daily at 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, is both a prebiotic and a probiotic, as well as a stimulator of intestinal contractions. Therefore, any dysbacteriosis can be cured within a month by properly consuming boiled beetroot at a dose of 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, and there is no need to take any lacto or bifidobacteria. And another thing, we need fiber. And where can we get this fiber? It comes from vegetables and fruits. But if we already have impaired function of the large intestine, the number of bacteria present there is not enough to digest this fiber, and this can cause us to feel bloated. So how do we get out of this situation? We add fermented foods. That's why sauerkraut, fermented apples, fermented tomatoes, and fermented cucumbers are good options. Everything should be naturally fermented. Not store-bought, where vinegar is added, but naturally fermented, where there are also many natural bacteria. This will help your intestines. Every day, you don't need much, just a little. You see, even my mouth waters when I think about it. Right away the brain says, oh, these are the right foods, you should eat them. So not too much, it's individual for everyone. If you overeat, you'll feel worse. Additionally, we can also eat, for example, baked apples. Yes, baked apples, especially when they have the skin, contain a lot of pectin. You can add, for example, a little honey to these apples. You can add a bit of cinnamon to them. Some people add lemon in small amounts. All of this helps. Additionally, what else we can use are choleretic products, which, as you remember, will create optimal conditions for the functioning of the lower sections of the gastrointestinal tract. So what are these products? These are fatty, spicy, bitter, and sour foods. That is, a little bit of lard, a bit of pepper here and there, a few spices added, a bit of bitter radish, a little viburnum. You don't need a lot. To make sure you're comfortable, please remember, medicine is only different from poison by the dose. So you can eat all foods, but some are only meant to be eaten once. What do you think? Can you eat these berries? You can. But then I get poisoned. So, to make sure this doesn't happen in your life, combine foods properly. But there's another important point. Besides combining foods, you also need to consider the emotional component. Because from a holistic perspective, emotions are also very important. And what kind of emotions will disrupt the functioning of our gastrointestinal tract? It's those emotions that I can't digest. Any illness that, for example, appears in your life, especially those related to the intestines, is a problem that I can't cope with. If I don't accept it, if I get angry about it, if I can't come to terms with it because I'm constantly fighting it, this will lead to intense surges of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, cause capillary spasms, slow down recovery processes, and hinder the functioning of our parenchymal organs. As a result, there will be an enzyme deficiency and bloating. So remember, working with your emotions and taking care of your physical health will give you well-being, because only thoughtful people in today's world can be healthy. This was Dr. Vasyl Chaika with you.